Welcome, my friends, to Liberty Square. There's a couple of interesting things here in Liberty Square that are worth spending a few minutes to talk about. The first of which, of course, is the Hall of Presidents. The Hall of Presidents is an attraction that was created as part of an add-on to something that Walt Disney had in mind when he was talking about what he'd like to have in terms of historical monuments and things that he would like to talk about with respect to the history. He was a history buff, and he wanted to have something that reflected back on the history of the United States. So he created the idea for the Hall of Presidents, the kernel of the idea, that then was created into the actual Hall of Presidents.
Why is the Hall of Presidents featured as an attraction? Everything else seems to be themed toward a unique concept like the Haunted Mansion or a particular Disney-owned property like, say, Peter Pan. But the answer lies with Walt himself. He saw the importance of remembering what brought us to where we are today, of honoring our history. Looking back at Walt's life, as a teen in 1917, young Walt Disney became very interested in the conflict going on in Europe at the time. His older brother Roy had joined the Navy, but Walt was not old enough to enlist. But Walt was nothing if not clever. Had his mother sign his passport and then changed his age on the passport. Old enough on paper, he joined the Red Cross ambulance unit that was heading over to Europe. Soon he was overseas in France with the Red Cross Ambulance Corps as a driver serving his country. And so began a strong patriotic sense of duty in Walt Disney. Flash forward to December of 1941. Time magazine had plans to put Dumbo on the cover of its magazine that month, but Pearl Harbor changed everything as the U.S. engaged in a global conflict. It's one of those moments that galvanized a nation, and introducing a war theme in place of Dumbo certainly made sense. And Walt Disney got involved at home. Throughout the Second World War, the Walt Disney Studios worked with the United States government to produce both training films and propaganda films to help the war effort. In 1941, Walt Disney spoke before the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City and said, "Tomorrow will be better. For as long as America keeps alive the ideas of freedom and better life, all men will want to be free and share our way of life. I thank God and America for the right to live and raise my family under the flag of tolerance, democracy, and freedom." On top of that, his memories of Marceline, Missouri, old-time America, and turn-of-the-century lifestyle, and his involvement in the war efforts fueled the designs for the patriotic spirit in all of his theme parks and, above all, to the signature trademark recognized by all guests, Main Street USA. Now, Main Street USA represents small-town America as Walt remembers it from his boyhood. And the objective was to recreate old-time America using the feeling of the turn of the century when new ideas were coming into play. It's at the heart of the Magic Kingdom's America that a little-known ceremony takes place at Town Square. At dusk in the Magic Kingdom, there is a flag retreat ceremony that's conducted. During this ceremony, the American flag flying above Town Square is brought down while the national anthem is played. But if Main Street serves as a view into the past, Liberty Square delves into our history. The Magic Kingdom's Liberty Square recreates the feel of the days of the American Revolution. It offers several different types of architecture for that time, including Dutch Amsterdam, Federal, and Georgian style. The idea is to focus on all of America's past. The replica of the Liberty Bell standing in front of the Liberty Tree is the showcase of the centerpiece of Liberty Square.
Surrounding the Liberty Bell are the flags from the original 13 U.S. colonies and the American flag from that period of time.
The Liberty Tree itself has 13 lanterns hanging from its limbs, representing the original 13 colonies. The Liberty Tree commemorates the communal meeting place of the Sons of Liberty, who in 1865 protested the imposition of the Stamp Act. During the 1970s, the Magic Kingdom conducted a daily ceremony called Sons and Daughters of Liberty, where a boy and a girl would be chosen to take part in this ceremony held in front of the Liberty Bell. Now, in this ceremony, a small fife and drum unit marched out from in front of the Liberty Bell, and a cast member dressed in a revolutionary attire read a proclamation that declared that these two guests were newly named members of the Sons and Daughter of Liberty. Across the way, Colonial Hall, which houses the Hall of Presidents, incorporates architecture designs used in Boston and Philadelphia when the Declaration of Independence was signed, and the Constitution of the United States were being forged. The date on the front is 1787. That's the year in which the Constitution was ratified. In keeping with the patriotic theme, the Liberty Tree Tavern is patterned after 18th century colonial inns. The taste of Americana is also found within the rivers of America, and the paddle boat, best remembered as the main transportation along the Mississippi River.
One minor detail that I wanted to point out, if you look down at the ground, you'll notice that it's reddish in color with this brown sort of pebble section that's running throughout it. And that is to represent the sewage system that they had in colonial America. Yep, it used to actually literally run down the streets. That's the way they disposed of their sewage. So this is evocative of that in a very whimsical sort of way. The Imagineers don't really call attention to it, but it's obvious if you know what it is.
If you look at a map, you realize that the Hall of Presidents resides right in the heart of the Liberty Square, and that would be pretty much as Walt would have envisioned it. And speaking of that, there's a historical footnote here. Our nation's founders made the official motto of the fledgling nation, E pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. And that summed up the nature of what had been created. But in 1956, the nation was going through the height of the Cold War, and there was a fear of communism creeping through our society. Congress passed a joint resolution to replace the existing motto with, "In God We Trust." And why this is important is because Walt Disney was a founding member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, which was distinctly anti-communist and testified several times before Congress on the topic. I think it's safe to say that Walt Disney was about as pro-American as you could be. And so when he was thinking of a name for an attraction for his Disneyland park, he decided on something called One Nation Under God, which kind of encapsulated that feeling of the 1950s and what he wanted to have. It was about the American ideal. Walt wanted wax figures of all of the U.S. presidents, but later decided to make them animated figures. But unfortunately, technology was not on his side. The technology that Walt Disney wanted for the attraction wasn't quite where it needed to be, and so he could never get the concept going. But here's where the 1964 World's Fair comes back into play and intersects with history. That World's Fair was a seminal moment in the history of the parks, and here's why. Walt Disney decided to collaborate with his fellow Imagineers of the WED Enterprises to try to make the first audio animatronic figure in a human form, and he decided it would be one of his heroes, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. And the general concept they came up with was something called Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, and included a 6-minute talk by the President in the Illinois Pavilion at the World's Fair. And this animatronic Lincoln could move with quasi-human-like movements. It was actually kind of cool and very revolutionary for its time. It was rudimentary to be sure, but it was more than had ever been done before.
Our defense is in the preservation of the spirit which prizes liberty as the heritage of all men, in all lands, everywhere. Destroy this spirit, and you have planted the seeds of despotism around your own doors. At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us with a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring from amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all times or die by suicide.
Now, does all of this sound familiar? Of course. It's the beginnings of what we think of today as the Hall of Presidents. In fact, in 1958, Walt Disney had put together a map of Disneyland, and there was a future land depicted off of Main Street. This area never materialized, but it was called Liberty Street. It's a very similar concept to what ultimately became Liberty Square in Disney World. If you study the map carefully, you can make out a number of shops and exhibits that would be included in the area, like the Liberty Tree and Paul Revere's Silver Shop. A version of both of these eventually found their way into Liberty Square at Walt Disney World, although the Silver Shop is now long gone, has been replaced by the Christmas Shop. But also on this map was something called the Hall of Presidents. It was Walt's desire to create a show that told the story of the American Revolution. The centerpiece of this tale was to be a recreation of the chief executives. Unfortunately, again, the technology wasn't available. Now, Walt passed away on December 15, 1966, and by that time, plans were moving ahead for the still under construction Walt Disney World in the Lake Buena Vista, Florida. Since there was going to be another Disneyland-style theme park, Imagineers felt that one of the changes that would differentiate it between the Disneyland in California and the Magic Kingdom in Orlando should be some of the themed lands. The Imagineers decided that since Florida was close to New Orleans and Louisiana in terms of actual distance, that having a New Orleans square in the Magic Kingdom was a bit superfluous. So the old designs and concepts for Disney's Liberty Street at Edison Square were reviewed, and what became of it was the Magic Kingdom's Liberty Square. And that served as the alternative to New Orleans Square, and Liberty Square also serves as the alternative location for the Magic Kingdom's version of the Haunted Mansion, which is located in New Orleans Square in Disneyland. The Imagineers also thought that as a follow-up to the great moments with Mr. Lincoln, they could finally create Walt Disney's concept of one nation under God, or what would be described as the Hall of Presidents. Now let's take a look at the show and its surroundings. The Hall of Presidents is housed in a red brick colonial hall topped with a peaked tower. This architectural style is designed to recall Philadelphia and Boston and the meeting houses. You enter a rotunda with benches along the walls. Along the walls are paintings. Most of them were used in the movie portion of the attraction, including a 1787 Philadelphia and Lincoln Douglas debate. Also found in the lobby are a number of presidential portraits, and these are reproductions of paintings commissioned by each president during his term in office. Also on display are some real articles owned by the presidents, and there are also documents that they wrote. There's another display that holds many of the dresses the First Ladies wore on their inauguration day. And the sound system at one time played Buddy Baker's underscore for the movie softly in the background. Now, the show is in the next room, and it repeats itself every 20 minutes or so. So there's always a sign up that says next show in however long. But one of the first things guests encounter upon entering the waiting room is the Great Seal of the United States, crafted out of 100% wool carpet. Now, the fun side note here is that it actually took an act of Congress to grant Disney permission to display this seal outside of actual use with the President of the United States. Blue curtains covered 3 large-sized screens that took up the full width of the theater. On the screens was the great presidential seal. The sound of a drum roll signaled the start of the program. Now, the original film was narrated by Lawrence Dobkin. Disney veteran Paul Frees did many of the voices in the program, including George Washington, Stephen Douglas, and Governor Mifflin.
These immortal words, when first they were written, proclaimed to the world an idea new among men. They expressed a shining wish for a better way of life.
It's that same positive approach that guided Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, and in a larger sense characterized Walt Disney's approach toward American history. It heralds moments of accomplishment idealistically as defining marks in our shared experience as people. Any negative facets of American history are usually left to be dealt with only with an overall positive context of celebrating the past. The film celebrated the liberties of the American people, the United States Constitution, and the progress of America in its early years. After the formation of the Constitution, the first test of the Republic was the Whiskey Rebellion, which proved that the government would use force to ensure domestic tranquility.
Since this important byproduct was shipped from state to state, the federal government saw fit to levy a tax upon it. But the people objected in principle, and before long their opposition had flared up in riots. Here was the first challenge to the federal authority.
I have here an opinion from Justice Wilson advising that the courts of your state are unable to deal with the crisis through ordinary judicial proceedings. Under the law, this would empower me to use the federal militia.
Fortunately, the rebellion ended without bloodshed. The mere size of the militia overawed all further opposition. Washington had shown his people that the government was prepared to ensure domestic tranquility when necessary.
We move up to 1833, and President Andrew Jackson found himself dealing with another threat to domestic tranquility: South Carolina's nullification campaign to declare federal tariff laws null and void in South Carolina, and any effort to enforce them would lead to South Carolina's secession from the Union. Programs advanced to 1858 when a cause of sectionalism had grown stronger. The debates between Lincoln and Douglas were now dealt with in depth.
I say this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. A house divided against itself cannot stand.
That's what you think, you long drinker.
This doctrine of Lincoln's declaring that men are made equal by the Declaration of Independence and by divine providence, is a monstrous heresy.
This was the only time slavery was dealt with in depth during the program, and a later use of generation social crises would say that the Hall of Presidents had paid insufficient attention to that issue. And that's important, and we'll come back to that topic. Perhaps the most effective image of the entire movie segment appeared when Lincoln, now president, contemplating the horror of what's about to befall America, helped elevate the sequence into a moving artistic triumph.
Without union, the Constitution is only a piece of paper. I know there is a God, and that he hates injustice and slavery. I see the storm coming, and I know his hand is in it. If he has a place and work for me, and I think he has, I believe I'm ready. I am nothing, but truth is everything. And with God's help, I shall not fail.
Now, of course, the Constitution survived the conflict, making America a truly unified nation. The contrast between how Walt Disney's generation viewed this point in history and the common viewpoint of the Americans of the 1970s came into conflict at one point in the program. To an earlier generation, the Civil War's conclusion was both the end of a nightmare and the beginning of an uninterrupted golden age of progress and advancements for America. Such lingering issues, such as the failure of the Reconstructionists to provide a full racial equality and the struggle that still awaited women in their efforts to get their vote heard, were secondary to the things that helped boost America from the more rural, isolated society to the 19th century to the industrial world power of the 20th. And so the next part of the program noted the accomplishments of Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, and the inventions of the automobile and the motion pictures, among other things, as a part of the century of change. And you have to love, when you hear this, how Walt Disney's influence on entertainment leading to learning is demonstrated here. We've just talked about all these different things that are important historical footnotes in the history of the United States, but they're done in a style where you remember them and they stick with you and you think about them. Even though they were done in an animatronic style at a Walt Disney World attraction, you remember them. They become part of our collective consciousness, and I think that is really cool. I'd rather entertain and hope that people learn than teach them. I think that's really what it's all about. The fundamental philosophy of freedom, the belief in the rights of the individual, and the dignity of the man remained unaltered, and all the while the Constitution remained the tentpole of the country.
And the leaders of tomorrow must be as dedicated to its preservation as were the leaders of yesterday, as are the leaders of today. In this Hall of Presidents, let us pay homage to the immortal men whose illustrious names have been indelibly inscribed on history's roll of honor.
All 36, at the time, presidents are called in chronological order. And at the time the attraction opened in 1971, the roll call ended with Richard M. Nixon. Now, over time, each of the newly elected presidents, or in Ford's case, appointed presidents, would have an audio animatronic version of himself added to the show in their likeness. Now, each one of the presidents responds to their name with a nod, a wave, or some other sign of acknowledgement, as Hail to the Chief plays in the background. During the presentation, the presidents fidget, talk to each other, and look around, all the while making the illusion seem quite real. Now, once the roll call was complete, George Washington sat down in a chair, and that's a replica of the chair he used at the Constitutional Convention, and Abraham Lincoln stood up to deliver his oratory. The Lincoln speech drew heavily from Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, and the show winds up with the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The original attraction closed in September 1993 and was completely renovated and reopened in October of 1993. Now, also changed was the narrator. In the past, there were prominent members of the Disney company to narrate points of the film. Instead, poet Maya Angelou was brought in.
Constitutional Convention, charged with creating a document that would implement the principles of democracy for which they had fought so long and risked so much.
The changes to the show are credited to Eric Foner. He's a history professor at Columbia University, and he was able to persuade various Disney executives A new adaptation of the show was needed. Foner is responsible for completely rewriting and changing the script of the show in order to focus more on the slavery and other ethical and civil-related issues in the United States of America. And the entire script for The Hall of Presidents got somewhat of a makeover as well. Walt Disney had simply wanted a program that touched on the themes that unified Americans of all political perspectives and what gave them the ability to live in a free society and be justly proud of that. Going into the Hall of Presidents and coming away with a good feeling about the American experiment of government. Now, in the new program, the Constitutional Convention debate contains a curious moment where we hear a cacophony of voices arguing about the slavery issue. The only problem was that the slavery was never an issue under debate at the Constitutional Convention because those delegates from the non-slave states regarded the issue as too hot to handle. With Bill Clinton's addition to the Hall of Presidents came a new practice of having the current President of the United States deliver a speech prior to Lincoln's, in the President's own voice.
Independence. And today, our nation stands as a symbol of freedom and inspiration to people all around the world. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
Now, a change of presidents in 2001 led to another significant revision of the Hall of Presidents. The script was retained, but now was narrated by the unknown J.D. Hall instead of Maya Angelou. This time, George W. Bush delivered a speech, again written by the Disney staffer prior to the Lincoln speech.
But for every injustice, there has always been a voice crying out to writing, and America has always listened to those voices. We are listening today. And perhaps it falls to us, to this first generation of the 21st century Americans, to say once and for all that no child, no race, no creed, no ethnic community will ever again be left out.
In 2009, a number of updates were made to the show. It included the addition of President Barack Obama, and Morgan Freeman was brought on as the narrator of the show.
Monarchy, and for General George Washington to be crowned King of America. But the man who had led an army of farmers to victory over the mighty British Empire made it clear that the only title he desired was citizen of the United States of America.
But it also underwent some extensive renovation to upgrade its audio and visual effects systems. And George Washington was added as a third speaking president. All of the presidents up through George W. Bush were all sculpted by Disney legend Blaine Gibson. Blaine Gibson used paintings, photographs, and video to create each president's likeness. For Lincoln, an actual life mask taken in 1860 was used. Barack Obama's audio-animatronic version was sculpted by his apprentice, Valerie Edwards. The crafting of the opening day presidents took 2 years to complete. The clothing that each president wears is an accurate representation of the time period in which he lived. Even the tailoring technique and fabric type used are correct for the decade in which the president was in office. Small, unseen details include braces for FDR's legs, Bush's Indigo Timex watch. For Obama, Imagineers recreated his wedding ring.
Gerald R. Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush.
That notification on the 14th day of April, 1789, that you had selected me to lead our nation.
The American dream is as old as our founding, but as timeless as our hopes. It is reborn every day in the heart of every child who wakes up in a land of limitless possibilities, in a country where we the people means all the people.
In about 2015 or so, the Walt Disney Company made a decision to change the way they looked at the Hall of Presidents. The idea was to kind of reframe it to a large degree, to kind of look at history through a different lens and maybe recreate some of what Walt's original vision was, where we look at the history of the United States and the presidency specifically, and maybe sort of rethink it. So the idea was to close it down, retool it, and remove the speaking part for whoever the president would be. It didn't really fit anymore with sort of the cycle of where we were. It was time to change and move on and think about our history through a different lens. But the person that won in 2016 had a problem with that. They became kind of political, and so at the end of the day, the Disney Company decided to add a speaking part in for him.
A leader not separate from the people, but elected by the people, from among the people. we, the people. This is a new idea, an American idea, the idea of a president.
Disney really wanted it to be about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and other presidents who had spent time during a time of crisis in this country. They didn't really want to have the current president speaking anymore. So this is where we netted out. Now the oh by the way is, the narrator in this case is Joy Vandervoort Cobb. She's a theater instructor at the College of Charleston. She's interesting because she actually talks about social justice in her plays and her works. Leave it to Disney to be deliberate in what they decide to do. And that's where we are with the Hall of Presidents today. What the future holds, who knows? But I think it's safe to say that Disney really wants to encapsulate our country's history through the presidents of the United States, really bringing in Walt's vision.
Or will it become another focus for the arms race? The choice is urgent, and it is ours to make.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall overcome.
Today we celebrate a victory, not of a bloody military campaign, but of an inspiring peace campaign.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. You have lost too much, and you have certainly not lost America.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
The willingness to speak out for what is right, to shake up the status quo, that's America.
Now you may think to yourself, that's the end of the Hall of Presidents story. And that's not quite true. Because in 1982, when Disney decided to build Epcot and have the American Adventure be a key pavilion hosting all of the other nations, they decided to create something that's colloquially referred to, especially internally, as the Hall of Presidents 2.0. And that's the show that's at the American Adventure that really encapsulates what it's like to be an American and what it's like to have lived through different times in America. And really, it is sort of the Hall of Presidents kind of extended on a little bit. Or maybe you could say it's more like Walt Disney's vision of one nation under God that I mentioned earlier in this video. To me, I love the fact that Disney carried on this concept and moved it forward to think about the next generation.